The priest should always carry himself in a dignified and recollected spirit of prayer throughout the entire Mass. He should always walk face forward with head and shoulders held erect at a measured and unhurried pace. His eyes should be kept cast down a few paces directly in front of him. If he is not carrying anything while walking, the hands are always held joined before the breast. When the priest stands at the altar, he should face the altar squarely, standing erect, and not with bowed head or slumped shoulders. His feet should be close together, and he should never lean up or rest against the altar. When standing at the epistle side, he always faces the missal squarely. If the missal is at the center, he stands with his feet facing forward, but he may turn slightly at the waist to read from the missal when necessary. At the gospel side, he stands facing the missal at an angle to the altar. Any time the priest must move from the center of the altar to the missal and back, he first turns in the direction he intends to walk, and then proceeds parallel to the altar at a slow and measured pace. The priest may walk at an angle to the altar only if he is carrying an object which he must keep over the altar, such as the missal after the gospel or the chalice at the ablutions. Even if the distance is very small, he should never shuffle sideways or step backwards. He may, however, take a small step backwards if it is necessary to make room to kiss the altar or genuflect. Any time the priest must turn around to face the people, he always turns by his right and then turns back around by his left, returning the same way that he came. The only two exceptions to this rule are the Orate Fratres during the offertory and the final blessing at the end of the Mass. These will be the only times when the priest continues turning by his right to make a complete circle. Whenever the priest is not carrying anything or performing any liturgical gesture, the hands are always held joined at the breast at a slight angle with the fingers pointed upwards. Prior to the consecration, the hands are joined with the palms flat against one another, the fingers extended and held together with the right thumb crossed over the left. From the consecration until the ablutions, the tips of the thumb and forefinger may not be separated in order to safeguard any particles of the sacred host from falling outside the corporal. The remaining fingers are held extended and close together. For certain prayers during the Mass, the rubrics direct the priest to bow and rest his joined hands on the mensa of the altar. Whenever the priest performs this gesture, the ring fingers are laid on top of the altar at the edge of the mensa, and the pinky fingers are pressed against the front of the altar. Prior to the consecration, this gesture occurs at the Oramus Te Domine, the In Spiritu Humilitatis, the Suscipe Sancte Trinitas, and the Te Igitur. After the consecration, this gesture is done at the Supplices Te Rogamus and the three prayers before communion. It is also performed once more at the end of Mass when the priest says the Placeat. At various times throughout the Mass, the rubrics direct the priest to separate his hands. They may be separated and immediately rejoined, as the priest does whenever he turns around and says, Dominus vobiscum. They may be separated and held extended, as when he reads the principal prayers of the Mass during the canon. Or they may be extended, elevated, and rejoined, as he does at the beginning of the Gloria and the Creed, the Veni Sanctificator, just before the Te Igitur, and before the final blessing. The hands should never be extended beyond the width of the shoulders, nor are the palms ever raised above the height of the shoulders. Any time the priest extends his hands, he always keeps the fingers close together and pointed upwards. The palms of each hand should always be turned so that they are held parallel, facing one another. Prior to the consecration, the thumb and forefinger are held extended. After the consecration, they are kept joined. The rubrics also direct the priest at times to place his hands on the altar. Whenever the priest places one or both hands on the altar, the hand is always placed palm down, flat, with the entire palm on the altar and not just the fingers. Prior to the consecration, the hands are placed outside the corporal. From the consecration to the ablutions, the hands are placed inside the corporal, but near the edge, so that they don't come into contact with the host or any particles that may be on the corporal. Both hands are placed on the altar anytime the priest genuflects or kisses the altar. One hand is usually placed on the altar anytime the priest must perform some liturgical gesture with the other hand, such as when he makes the sign of the cross over an object or turns the page of the missal. There are a number of common movements with the hands that are performed many times during Mass, which it is good to practice and have memorized. The sign of the cross is always made with the right hand. When making the sign of the cross on oneself, the left hand is always placed flat against the breast, and the right hand held fully extended with the fingers close together. The priest traces the sign of the cross, his fingertips touching first the forehead, then breast, then left shoulder, then right shoulder. When the priest makes the sign of the cross on himself after the consecration, the left hand is held against the breast, not flat but turned, so that the joined thumb and forefinger do not touch the vestments. Only the 3 extended fingers of the right hand touch the forehead, breast, and shoulders. The priest makes several small signs of the cross before reading the Gospel. When making the small sign of the cross on oneself, the left hand is placed flat against the breast, and both the fingers and the thumb of the right hand extended in an L shape. The whole hand is moved to trace the sign of the cross with the soft part of the thumb on the forehead, lips, and breast. Whenever the sign of the cross is made over people or objects, the right hand is always turned so that the pinky finger faces the person or object being blessed. The forearm, wrist, and hand are always held straight, and the entire arm and hand moved when tracing the sign of the cross. The fingers should always be held fully extended and close together, except after the consecration, when the thumb and forefinger are kept joined. Signs of the cross are always made in the form of a Greek cross. This means the length of the vertical and horizontal lines traced should be identical. The exact dimensions of the cross will vary depending on the size of the object. When making the sign of the cross over both host and chalice together, the dimensions are from the middle of the pall to the middle of the host. When over the host, the dimensions are that of the host. When just over the chalice, the dimensions are that of the pall. When the priest makes the sign of the cross over the people at the final blessing, the dimensions are the same as when the priest blesses himself: forehead to breast, and left shoulder to right shoulder. Any time the priest must make the sign of the cross over a person or an object, he will always first join his hands and then make the sign of the cross, placing the left hand on the altar. There are 4 times when the priest strikes his breast during Mass: at the Confiteor, at the Nobis Quoque Peccatoribus, at the Agnus Dei, unless it is a Requiem, and at the Domine non sum dignus, immediately before communion. Whenever the priest strikes his breast, he always does so with the right hand. Before the consecration, he strikes his breast with all 5 fingers extended. After the consecration, he strikes his breast with only 3 fingers extended, keeping custody of the thumb and forefinger. The practice of keeping proper custody of the hands is especially important when handling the altar missal. Because different missals are arranged differently depending on the publisher and the age and size of the missal, page turns can frequently occur in unexpected or awkward places. It is very helpful to familiarize yourself with the particular altar missal you will use before saying Mass, noting especially where the propers of the Mass are located and where the page turns will occur in the canon. At Low Mass, the altar missal is placed on the epistle side of the altar before Mass, with the book closed and the pages facing towards the center. When the priest opens and closes the book, he does so with both hands, opening it back to front, or turning it on its spine and opening both ends at once. When the missal is at the epistle or gospel sides of the altar, the priest uses both hands to turn the page or move the ribbon. When the missal is at the center of the altar, the priest uses only the left hand to turn the page, placing the right hand flat on the altar. Prior to the consecration, the priest may use the thumb and forefinger of the left hand to turn the page or move the ribbon. After the consecration, the right hand is placed inside the corporal, and the left hand turns the page using only the second and third finger, since the priest cannot disjoin his thumb and forefinger. Whenever the priest must cover or uncover the chalice during Mass, the right hand always takes the pall and the left hand is always placed at the base of the chalice to steady it. The pall is usually placed leaning up against the altar card or the back of the altar. It may also be placed on the corporal or leaned against the folded chalice veil. In order to maintain proper recollection throughout the Mass, it is important that the priest keep strict custody of his eyes. The rubric always directs that whenever the priest is not reading the text of a prayer, he keep his eyes cast down in front of him. This is especially important when he is walking to and from the altar and whenever he turns around to face the people. When reading a prayer from the missal or the altar card, he must look at the text of the prayer even if he has the prayer memorized. Exceptions to this are at the offertory, when the priest must look at the host while saying the Suscipe Sancte Pater, and the altar cross while saying the Oferimus Tibi, and at the Pater Noster and the three prayers before communion, when he must look at the sacred host for the entire duration of the prayers. He should also keep his eyes intently fixed on the sacred species anytime he elevates them or genuflects after the consecration. There are 9 times during the Mass when the priest must raise his eyes to heaven. This usually means a momentary lifting of the eyes up to the altar cross or to the principal image behind the altar. It should only be a lifting of the eyes with a slight tilting of the head. The priest should never crane his neck or look straight up. The rubrics direct that each prayer be spoken in a specific tone of voice. There are 2 tones of voice used in the Low Mass. The first tone is the Vox Clara, or loud tone, which should be pronounced in a clear and distinct voice, so that those who need to make the responses can easily hear the priest.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. In tribu adultari Dei.
Ad Deum creatificat juventutem meam.
Iudicime Deus et Ascene.
The actual volume of the loud tone will differ depending on the circumstances. If there are other priests at nearby altars also offering Mass, the loud tone will be raised only slightly above a whisper so as not to disturb the masses of the other priests.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
If the Mass, however, is one in which the people will be making the responses along with the server, the loud tone should be elevated so that those in the pews will be able to hear and respond.
Dominus vobiscum.
The second tone is the Vox Secreta, or the quiet tone, which should be heard only by the priest himself. The volume of the quiet tone should not be much more than a whisper, but should still be distinctly pronounced and audible to the priest. This is especially important for the words of consecration to ensure the validity of the Mass. They must be pronounced distinctly, but quietly.
Hoc est enim corpus meo.
Throughout the course of the Mass, the priest will make a number of reverences to express adoration, veneration, and respect for God, Mary, the saints, and the Pope. The rubrics prescribe a number of different kinds of vows and genuflections to signify the reverence due. Vows made during Mass will either be of the head or of the body. Each is divided into different degrees depending on to whom the reverence is being made. There are 3 degrees of bows of the head. The slight bow is a slight bowing of the head only, with no movement of the shoulders. It is usually made to the Missal at the name of the Pope, or at the mention of the saint whose feast is being celebrated. The medium bow of the head is a deeper bow, but still with no movement of the shoulders. It is made at the mention of the holy name of Mary, and is usually made towards the Missal. If the principal image above the altar is of Our Lady, there is a long-standing custom of bowing the head towards the image, although this is no longer required by the rubrics. The low, or profound, bow of the head is a low bowing of the head combined with a slight inclination of the shoulders, but no bending at the waist. Only the head and shoulders are bowed. This bow is made at the mention of the holy name of Jesus, at the doxology and the Gloria Patri, whenever the priest says Oremus, and any time a bow is prescribed towards the altar cross or to the sacred host. When standing at the center of the altar, this bow will be made towards the altar cross. At the Gospel, it is made towards the Missal. When standing at the epistle side, the direction of this bow is not prescribed by the rubrics, and the priest may bow either towards the Missal or to the altar cross. There are 2 degrees of bows of the body, medium and profound. The medium bow of the body is a low head bow combined with a deeper inclination of the shoulders and a slight bending at the waist. It is made for numerous prayers throughout the Mass, sometimes with hands joined on the altar and sometimes with hands at the breast. The profound bow of the body is a profound inclination at the waist, such that the fingertips could touch the knees. This bow is made for the Confiteor at the beginning of Mass, for the Munda Cor Meum, for the first part of the Te Igitur, for the Supplices Te Rogamus, and also at the beginning and end of Mass at an altar where the Blessed Sacrament is not reserved. A genuflection is a sign of profound adoration and is made during those parts of the Mass when special attention is called to the presence of our Lord on the altar, or a particular reference made to his incarnation. Whenever the priest must genuflect at the altar, he always places both hands flat on the altar, keeps his head and shoulders erect, lowers his right knee to the floor close to the heel of his left foot, and then rises in one fluid movement. In the Low Mass, all genuflections which are done at the altar are prescribed by the rubrics, and should be made whether the Blessed Sacrament is present on the altar or not. Reverences made at the foot of the altar, however, depend on whether the Blessed Sacrament is reserved either in a tabernacle on the altar or immediately behind the altar. When saying Mass at an altar where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, whenever a reverence is to be made at the foot of the altar, the priest genuflects, placing his right knee against the first step. At the very beginning and the very end of Mass, when the celebrant is holding the chalice in his hands, he genuflects placing his knee on the floor, not against the step. If the priest celebrates Mass at an altar where the Blessed Sacrament is not reserved, the reverence made at the foot of the altar is a profound bow instead of a genuflection. Whenever the rubrics direct the priest to kiss the altar, the priest separates his hands and lays them flat on the altar. He then bends straight down and kisses the mensa of the altar near the edge. He should always bend straight down to kiss the altar without craning his neck to either side. If the mensa is particularly narrow, he may take a step back from the altar and kiss the edge. The priest kisses the altar each time he turns around to face the people, and also during the prayers Oramus te Domine, the te igitur, and the supplices te rogamus.